Our author, Ruth Franklin, is a biographer and book critic whose work has appeared in every single magazine you read. She's a former editor of the New Republic. She's been a New York Public Library Cullman Fellow, and she's a Guggenheim Fellow in biography. And so it's not surprising that Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, has been getting just crazy reviews, the best reviews. Really highly deserved, amazing reviews. It's great. In the New York Times, Charles McGrath opened his review with this line. Shirley Jackson once wrote that when she went to the hospital to deliver the third of her 4 children, the admitting clerk asked for her occupation. Writer, Jackson replied. The clerk said, I'll just put down housewife. Shirley Jackson had a tough life. She had a tough career. She didn't get nearly enough credit for being brilliant in either the literary world or her social world, and Ruth Franklin is here to fix that. She makes an amazing case for Jackson as a writer and as a feminist. It's a great book, and I'm so excited to welcome her to Politics and Prose.
Thank you so much, Lily, for that wonderful introduction. It's so much fun to be here at Politics and Prose, this amazing bookstore in Washington, D.C., where I lived. Not only did I live here for many years while I was working at the New Republic, and I'm so happy to see so many of my friends from those days here. But I also spent a lot of time here working on this book, which really kind of has its origins in D.C. because Jackson's archive is at the Library of Congress. So I spent a lot of the past 6 years or so, the period that I spent working on this book, shuttling back and forth between Brooklyn and Washington for intense, 9-hour stints in a windowless room at the library, pouring through these boxes and boxes full of papers. And what I found there is what went into this book. And, I'll tell you a little story about that archive, which is one thing I discovered while looking in it, was that the library was originally interested in the papers of Stanley Edgar Hyman, Shirley Jackson's husband, whom some of you may have heard of. I see people nodding. He was, for his time, a very famous literary critic. And frankly, it's very sobering for those of us who call ourselves book critics to see just how ephemeral that work can be. But during his lifetime, he was very important and influential, and he was considered the big academic in the family. So when the Library of Congress wrote to him asking if they could have his papers as a donation after his death, they said, oh, and by the way, we're also interested in your wife's. And it was sort of bittersweet to come across that letter in Stanley Hyman's file, but also to know that 50 years later, 50 years after Jackson's death, it's her papers that are kept on site at the Library of Congress and accessed by many researchers, and Stanley Hyman's that are kept off-site somewhere out there in the suburbs and must be specially requested and waited for days to arrive. So I'm curious, how many people here have read The Lottery? I realize this is a self-selecting group. Okay. How many people here have read something else by Shirley Jackson? All right, well, this is a self-selecting group. But, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Jackson has a strange and unusual distinction, which is that she's almost universally known for the lottery, at least among Americans who went to school in this country after, say, 1950 or so. If you fall into that category, you likely read The Lottery in middle school, in high school, in college. But her other work is much less well known. And I think it's because of a misconception about Jackson as a writer that arose almost from the start of her career. You may have heard that she was almost as famous for being a suspected or an alleged witch as she was for being a writer. There are lots of stories that circulated about her. One reviewer, in a line that was repeated over and over again, so many times, in fact, that I had a lot of trouble sourcing this line back to its original author, like to say that she wrote not with a pen but a broomstick. That line even was repeated in her obituary. And Time magazine called her, in another wonderful line, the Virginia werewolf of seance fiction, whatever exactly seance fiction is. And Jackson, I think, enjoyed this aspect of her reputation. She liked to tease people about it. She liked to kind of goad reporters into trying to get her to, elaborate along these lines. There's one story that she loved to tell about the publisher Alfred Knopf, who became embroiled in a long and disputatious contract disagreement with Stanley Hyman over his first book. And coincidentally, during that dispute, Alfred Knopf went skiing in Vermont and broke his leg. And Jackson liked to tell reporters that this was her doing through her witchcraft. And the reason she had to wait for him to go skiing in Vermont was because she wasn't allowed to do witchcraft across state lines. Everybody knows that. So, these stories, they're funny and they're irresistible to reporters. They were repeated so often. And I think they contributed to a misconception about Jackson as a writer and as a human being that sadly has persisted for much of the last few decades. And in fact, it was for the case for me as well that, I knew Jackson primarily as the author of The Lottery, also of The Haunting of Hill House, which has been one of my favorite novels as long as I can remember. But I honestly hadn't really been aware of much of her other work until more recently, when I had started to read more widely and realized what a diverse group of work she had been responsible for. Not only 6 novels ranging widely in subject matter, dozens of short stories, but also 2 memoirs about her life as the mother of 4 children, the wife to her absent-minded professor husband, and a menagerie of pets that she also loved to write about. And these memoirs were derived from magazine essays that she wrote for women's magazines throughout the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s that were very, very popular at the time and won her a following among the women who read these magazines. And, Lily stole my favorite story about how she was checking into the hospital to deliver her child, and the clerk said, "I'll just put down housewife." And that story appears actually in a magazine piece Jackson wrote called "The Third Baby's the Easiest." As the mother of 3 myself, I can only assume that is some kind of perverse joke. But, when I read that story, I felt in a way that was the key to understanding Shirley Jackson, that story just speaks volumes about what it was like to be a writer, and a writer who is also a mother, during a period, the late 40s, the early 50s, when that was, to say the least, not an obvious choice for a woman to make. And as I began to read more deeply and to research in her archive, I realized that the story of Jackson's life really encapsulates the dilemmas that were faced by so many American women at the mid-century. This moment that was right on the cusp of the women's movement, but not there yet, in the tension that she felt between her marriage and her professional life. And that tension is what forms the undercurrent beneath so much of Jackson's work. Even what we think of as her horror writing, or the psychological suspense, is primarily concerned with women's lives and women's issues. She's got these early stories about career women and their isolation in the big city, where they're prey to the ministrations of men who may or may not be some kind of demon lover in disguise, a figure from English mythology that she inserts into the realism of the texture of American urban city life. Her first novel,